Hello chat, today I'm returning to the video series of Misplaced reviews. Originally, I was going to do a video on 3 matches, one against Esper Midrange, one against a different Esper Midrange deck, and then one against White-Black. I decided to split them into 3 unique videos, mostly to make the info more understandable and easier to watch in smaller parts. That way you could sort of break it down match by match by match instead of watching an hour and a half of me yammering on all at once. So in these next few videos, it might be a little choppy, it might sound a bit weird, I might reference things in other videos, and that's just because I originally recorded them to be all in one video. So hope it's not too jarring, hopefully it still translates, and hopefully you enjoy it anyways. Thank you for watching. Hello chat, welcome back to another episode of Misplaced Reviews. After the first review of Boros Energy vs. Zoo, I had a lot of really positive comments, including ones that specifically wanted to see my Boros play versus White-Black Midrange or Esper Midrange, so that's what I am doing for this video. A few things I want to go over before we really get into it. For this video, I'm going to be going over 3 matches with 3 unique Esper or White-Black archetypes, all in matches I've streamed on my Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/misplacedginger, and these are all videos or VODs on my YouTube channel currently. So if you haven't checked these out and you want more Boros content, you should go ahead and watch some of those or check out my Twitch channel. Another point I want to touch on is how I plan on playing against these White-Black mid-range matchups. A good majority of these cards are pretty strong. You have Psychic Frog, which is one of the best creatures in the format, Ketramose, which is a strong engine card that generates card advantage and is hard to kill and closes the game eventually, and then Overlord of the Baelmerk, which is, again, another very strong, hard to interact with threat, but it also sort of tutors your other threats that you want and can really outgrind your opponent. If your opponent has a problematic card like Psychic Frog and you kill the frog, they can just Overlord it back. It also combos really well with Solitude, which is one of the few actual removal spells in the opponent's deck. So they can get away with Solitude pitching and bringing back a Solitude and not losing too much value in a sense, because the Overlord picks up the Solitude for later or for immediate removal if they need it, but also eventually the Overlord will come into play as a 5/5 and you need to deal with that. Outside of that, I think the deck has a lot of fluff, a lot of cards that really rely on those 3 main things. So your Emperor of Bones, your Flicker Wisps, and your Phalias really are synergy-based cards. They're not really power-based cards. But when you have the first 3 cards, the Psychic Frog, the Ketramose, or the Overlord, the value that is gained by having your Emperor of Bones, Flicker Wisp, and Phalias is kind of unmatched compared to the rest of the format. So you really need to make sure that you have a plan for the Esper or the White-Black deck's engine, because a lot of their value, a lot of their ways they win is about sort of snowballing an advantage. It's presenting a threat and then sort of like slowly gaining more and more value. So in order to stop that, you really need to like nip the bloom or nip the flower at the bud and try your hardest to interact with whatever they're setting up while they're setting it up, and not once they already have a few cards of value out of these things. Sometimes you will get 2 for 1, but that's okay because you're choosing to get 2 for 1 rather than 4 for 1. And the times where you get 2 for 1 and not 4 for 1, you're technically up a few cards. I know it sounds weird, but you're up a few cards because the opportunity cost is like you're not potentially down 2 cards, right? And I'll go over that in play patterns and examples in this video, but I really just want to drive home that a lot of how you should be playing this matchup as the Boros player is trying to stop them from setting up some sort of engine or setting up a way to win the game fast, or a way to like overpower the board. This is easier said than done, but honestly, when I say that a lot of their deck is fluffy, I mean it. I think they have a lot of dead cards a good amount of the time, or when you interact with the powerful cards, the synergy cards that need these other powerful cards lose a lot of value, and they aren't actually worth the full card, so you're actually gaining a lot of value in that sense. So again, I'll go over this in the match, and I'll point out how to sort of invalidate that, or how to make sure that you don't get blown out by that. But for the most part, that is my game plan. I really want to make sure that they aren't snowballing, they aren't gaining these little pieces of value over a long period of time. So now that I've talked about sort of how the Esper deck and the white-black decks kind of start to play, and how Boros should sort of respond, I also want to make a point to go over what happens if you end up in a position where you can see your opponent setting something up and you realize you can't really do much about it, or the cards that you have don't really line up into what they're doing well enough, and you kind of need a bit of time, or you need to wait a few turns in order to like shut it down. This happens when you don't have galvanic blasts specifically, or sorry, galvanic discharges. Discharge is obviously the most efficient removal in the deck, but sometimes you have things like Thraben Charm, sometimes you have things like Phlages, and although Thraben Charm is modal and hits the Overlord, it is 2 mana, and sometimes you can't afford to really play your 2 mana spells because you will get tempoed out. Even if you are gaining a bit of value by using it, you kind of need to do a heel turn and try to be the aggressor and hope that your opponent doesn't have it all, or when they do have it all, you can still draw out of it somehow or punish them if they stumble. Now, this is hard to visualize without really. There are two main things I want to make sure about when I'm playing this match, and is, can I actually shut down my opponent's setup to snowball? And if I can, good. We're gonna try and do that. I'm gonna set up my game plan to do that. And then if I can't do that, how am I actually winning the game? Like, what is my game plan? Do I have to like just let them have a few extra cards and like take that value on the chin and like say okay, or can I just try and be aggressive and out aggro them and hope that their mana base and their Thoughtseize sort of deal enough damage that a Goblin Bombardment will kill them eventually? So we'll get right into the first match here. Here I am playing, I think, a pretty stock Boros list. Now, this was, I think, 4 to 6 weeks ago. So I think this list I'm specifically playing 4 Seasoned Pyromancers and no Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which isn't super relevant, but is a like noteworthy. That with that in mind, I don't think my opponent's playing Bowmasters, so I'm not super worried about that. So here, this is pretty straightforward. I've talked about this before, but I think as Boros, you have a lot of 1-land hands that you can keep. I think I was in the dark. I didn't know what my opponent was playing. It is Steven Dykman, so he has a wide range of decks he could be playing, and honestly, I thought he was on a combo deck probably. So keeping 1-lander Ragavan against combo is pretty strong. Obviously, we got lucky and ripped the second land, but we have 2 1-drops in the dark against combo. Ragavan's the best card you can have. Again, the times where it does die or get solituded, I still have a follow-up, and then the times where I get lucky and spike a land, we're 21 over 52, not great odds, but whatever. We're in a really good spot. So here the game starts off pretty good for us. We get Ragavan on the play, and it loses a lot of value later in the game, so I really want to make sure that it gains the most amount of value it can. But they're also Solitude pitching another Solitude for it, which is very, very good for us. We started the game with a 2-for-1. Our opponent, I don't think, should be that afraid of Ragavan on this board. there's not a lot of things that really are that punishing for them at this spot. It does make sense that they have the Overlord here. It makes it so the Solitude is less punishing for them, although they do have to pitch another white card if they want to Solitude. If the Overlord replaces itself but doesn't actually impact the game, it is sort of not actually card advantage until the Overlord impacts the game. Now, if I choose to Thraben Charm the Overlord, so they picked up the Solitude. So the Solitude, like I said, it doesn't lose that much value. They did lose a card. So they exchanged 2 cards from my Ragavan. They're down a card. They untap and they play this Overlord. The Overlord picks up the other Solitude. So the Overlord replaces itself, but until the Overlord actually becomes a creature, it doesn't net a card. It just replaces itself. So they're at card parity -1 because they pitched a card to Solitude. If this Overlord ever gains more value, they then go to even, and the times where the Overlord gains value, it's most likely going to gain another card of value because I probably have to interact with it, or it's going to attack, or I'm going to lose the game. So it's important to understand that even though the Overlord replaces itself and Thraben Charming it here is just a straight up 2-for-1, preventing them from playing a Flicker Wisp next turn and gaining more value from it is very, very important. And although it is not a great play in the long run, in most circumstances, against this deck, I really think that you should be trying to, again, slow down their snowball and prevent them from accumulating a lot of value over a few turns. So the play I make this turn is incorrect. What I should have done was just Thraben Charm the Overlord and attack with the Voice of Victory. I'm not entirely sure why I didn't do this. I'll go over it. I'll go over it once I play through the turn. You'll see. So here I decide to Static Prison and play Guide of Souls. So this gives me enough energy to jump the Voice of Victory and attack for 5. The following turn, or the last turn, we knew they picked up Solitude with Overlord, and they didn't cast the Solitude. So it either means that they want the last white card in their hand, or they actually don't have another white card in their hand, or they don't value this Voice of Victory very highly. Either way, it means that they are kind of squeezed a bit on their resources. If they had an abundance of white cards or an abundance of resources in that regard, they would just get rid of the Voice of Victory because it prevents our snowball, but also they need to find a way to get back into this game out from underneath sort of like the squeeze I have. The other thing is that Voice of Victory represents a lot of damage over time. It attacks for 3 to start, but with bombardment, a potential bombardment, it does a lot more damage. And then with a potential bombardment, it also picks off a lot of their creatures during the game, which they need to sort of like snowball out of the card advantage hole that they've dug themselves into after pitching the Solitude. So to me, when they aren't pitching Solitude to hit this Voice of Victory, it means that they don't have a white card, or the white card they have is pretty important. That being said, there are quite a few white cards that they could have that are pretty important that they don't necessarily care about or don't care enough about to deal with this Voice of Victory. For example, if it's Ketramose and they have a third land, they can Ketramose plus try to spike a white card, exile the Voice of Victory, get a card back with the Ketramose, and they only take 3 damage potentially. Or they only take 3 damage on board. With his Guide of Souls, they take 2 extra points of damage. But again, if they set that up, they take a few extra points of damage, but the setup they do to not pitch the Solitude gets them an extra card if they wait for Ketramose. This play specifically I make somewhat makes sense, but overall it is incredibly flawed, and I get very punished for it. Static Prison is very bad in this matchup. Static Prison is really bad in this matchup. They have a lot of cards in their deck that interact with Static Prison very positively for them, built in without a high cost. For example, they have multiple Witch Enchanters. I think they have at least 3 usually. They have things like Flicker Wisp, and they have things like Phalia, so they can just blink the Static Prison. And I made a huge mistake here by exiling the Overlord with the Static Prison. So if they have something like Flicker Wisp, they can just Flicker Wisp the Static Prison, get back the Overlord, get a card back. And then even if I Static Prison the Overlord again, I get a little bit of energy, but they get a 3/1 and another card out of their graveyard. At this board state, we see they have a Witch Enchanter in the graveyard. If they have third White Source plus Flicker Wisp, we're just setting them up to like play a free 3/1 and then just make the same, like they just get a card for on top of their 3/1 that they already have. And we're behind now because they've netted a card, and my play on turn 2 actually doesn't do anything for me. You know what I mean? This is actually a good play for them because the natural plays that they would make are now better compared to the natural plays that they would make are worse. So not only does my play actually not improve my clock that much because we know they have the Solitude, it actually is the worst form of removal I could use because I'm Static Prisoning a creature that I could just Thraben Charm with. But it plays into a lot of the plays that they will naturally be making on turn 3. And of course, I neglected to mention, but they do have a Witch Enchanter in play as a land. If they have a White Source and they play Flicker Wisp, they don't have a lot of Flicker Wisp, but if they just have Flicker Wisp, I just see, I'm pointing it out on the video. If they have Flicker Wisp and just Flicker Wisp the land, they now get a 2/2, get to destroy the prison and get the Overlord back. And this is just so horrific. If their hand is Flicker Wisp and I just Thraben Charm the Overlord, they don't have a lot of good plays here. They can just choose not to fetch, or they can fetch and play a Ketramose, but it doesn't really accomplish that much. If they fetch Ketramose and exile the Flicker Wisp to the Solitude that we know about, they get a card back, but the Ketramose is also just not doing that much, and they take a damage. It's not close to attacking, and I can just still hold this Guide of Souls and this Static Prison for my turn 4. Static Prison is also much better at exiling a Ketramose or a card without a really punishing ETB compared to an Overlord of the Baelmerk. The cost of playing, the choice I made to play the Static Prison and the Guide of Souls to get in 2 extra points of damage with the Voice of Victory was very punishing because that 2 points is not worth allowing them to set up more. It's not worth getting blown out by not even just Flicker Wisp, but a fair amount of cards in their deck they could have naturally that don't require a lot of things. And so this sort of goes back to you really have to try and make plays to set up, beating their setup. Normally, I would say Static Prisoning their threat and playing a Guide of Souls is a good sequence in most matchups. It doesn't work out that way in these matchups. Even though Thraben Charm is a lower value play overall, in this specific spot, actually in a lot of spots against these matchups, you just need to find the best way to interact with their things, even if it's a bad 2-for-1, because the potential of getting 4-for-1 is so punishing. They picked up another Witch Enchanter. Oh, they pitched the Witch Enchanter to the Solitude. That makes sense. So here, we actually ended up in the same spot where I'm just casting a Thraben Charm on turn 4, and it's significantly worse than just casting it on turn 3. And I'm priced into casting it because this Overlord is now so valuable, the potential of it, that if I don't cast Thraben Charm here, I lose the game. If I cast Thraben Charm on turn 3 instead of the Guide of Souls plus Static Prison, they would be down a few cards. They'd be down a very strong board presence, and I would be up a few more cards also. They would still have the Solitude, but they are unlikely to be able to cast it because the Witch Enchanter they picked up was what they pitched to it. So I might still just have a Voice of Victory in play. Now here, it's funny because this matchup is the full roller coaster of sort of how these games play out. My opponent had a setup with Overlord, but they also pitched a bunch of cards to Solitude, so they were just down cards with Solitude. Even though they gained a bunch of value with this Overlord, and they gained a bunch of value because I played into their stuff and played poorly, we're still at parity. We're still at a very similar amount of resources, and my resources top deck a lot better than theirs do because they don't have a setup on board anymore. And so even though I allowed them to sort of start an engine, I stopped it before it could get any worse for me, and I stopped it before I gave a lot of values to their potential draws, if that makes sense. So all their Phalias, all their future Flicker Wisps, all their future Ketramoses, all their Ephemerates just don't have as much value, and that's got to be like 60 or 70% of their deck. The cards that don't have value, including things like lands. So even though I think I made a pretty egregious mistake, I think their deck is catching up to them here. They thought seized away our bombardment because they're not going to take a Flage, and now we've just presented a potential Flage 2-for-1. I got to interact with the Witch Enchanter. I think I'm probably supposed to kill the Flicker Wisp, even though I got to attack with the Guide of Souls. The 1 damage isn't super relevant here, and leaving a Flicker Wisp in play is not a good idea. Out of my position, it just has a lot more value than the Witch Enchanter, even though the Witch Enchanter does have a better sort of ETB against the cards in my deck that I want. The value isn't going to be realized, whereas Flicker Wisp's value is like you're more likely to have it be realized. It's just going to do more damage. It's going to have more impact with the other combo cards, Ephemerate, Phalia, etc. So, again, they have, I think, 2 cards here, and we're threatening this Flage. Here's funny. When I was watching this back the first time, I was like, oh, I'm going to put this Arena of Glory on top. It's going to look like I have a spell, and then I'm going to play this Flage and Flage their creature and hold the Arena of Glory so they don't know about it. And I mean, obviously it works out perfectly because they thought seize my dead card. Dead being a land that they're going to die to no matter what. They're just super dead to this Flage plus Arena of Glory anyways, but this is sort of like a small tidbit of like, if your opponent doesn't know about the Arena of Glory or they don't know about like a Ragavan, you don't always have to play them. And this is just like obviously the best outcome for me, where they have a bunch of Thoughtseizes and only 1 black source and just like can't really get back into the game from this position because they have a lot of fluff. But yeah, we just win the game. In short, like I said before we started, it's really, 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 really important to stop them from setting up a snowball or stop them from setting up a bunch of value early. Even if like you make the play like I did there, where you play into their natural lines in gameplay, you just have to like let them have the value and just interact with their spells. A lot of their deck is very fluffy. A lot of their deck is pretty dead and doesn't interact well unless they have like 3 or 4 unique cards. And it changes list to list, but you really just can punish them even if you lose a bit of value, even if you 2-for-1 yourself, because you gain that value back because they start drawing those low value cards. And that's how you really pull ahead in this matchup. Sideboarding. Here I'm doing a bunch of things that I really don't like. I don't know what I was thinking really at this moment. Not that it's necessarily incorrect. The first thing is, I'll start with the worst things. The first thing is I don't like Ghost Vacuum. I really don't think you should be boarding Ghost Vacuum in this matchup. A lot of these white-black, a lot of these Esper decks have Wrath of the Skies, so you can't really have a lot of sticky permanents in play. The other thing is Ghost Vacuum actually doesn't have that much value. It doesn't actually interact with Overlord that profitably. And most of the time, Ghost Vacuum's worse than a card you're taking out. It's not a threat it doesn't actually interact with anything, and it plays into their possible cards. It just makes your play patterns worse overall. The second thing is Blood Moon. I don't hate Blood Moon, but I also don't like Blood Moon. The thing about these decks is that they don't have a lot of basics, and they are sometimes reliant on the blue sources a little too much. The issue with that is that the cards that they're reliant on with blue are Frog, which costs 2 mana, and Blood Moon is not... First of all, it's not good against their actual threats like Frog or Ketramose or Overlord. So if they end up playing those before you play Blood Moon, you're just stuck with this 3 mana spell in your hand. Blood Moon is not lights out. They can just fetch a few basics, and naturally they might do that as the game plays out to save life, or to even just play around Blood Moon if they can. And then outside of that, they just naturally have answers to it in stuff like Witch Enchanter or other post-board removal. So the times where you're spending 3 mana for a do-nothing enchantment or a potential do-nothing enchantment, and they're spending 4 mana for a 2/2 that puts them up a card that time walks you, or the times where they instant speed exile it with Celestial Purge or March of Otherworldly Light, you just get super tempoed out because now they just get to untap. Another thing I want to sort of talk about is I've seen the Esper black-white decks take a controlling role post-board, or try to take at least a flash role. The thing about them taking a flash role is that they get to choose the pace at which they play the game. So sometimes that means early Thoughtseizes or early Fatal Pushes, and then they just cast Phalia, untap, pass, leave up removal, leave up other flash creatures if they have them, or cast Phalia and start jamming sticky permanents. It makes the play patterns of Boros difficult because you keep a lot of permanents in the deck post board that you need to actually have in play in order to win you the game. You can't attack with your Ocelot Prides or your Johnnies unless you put them into play, right? The other thing is one of the main removal spells we have is Flage. Flage is sorcery speed and 3 mana. It doesn't really interact very well against a lot of the cards that they have that they want to play in the early game. Emperor of Bones, Phalia, Overlord of the Baelmerk. I don't think you should be cutting Flage for this reason, but I think that you should be conscious of your mana values in your deck post board. Another reason why I don't like Blood Moon, another reason why I don't like Ghost Vacuum. So we don't want our deck to be clunky, and we don't want our deck to play into the things that they have in their deck that they're naturally going to have and that are normally going to be good against us. The other thing that I don't like here, I did mention Wrath of the Skies. I have seen a list of up to 4 Wrath of the Skies. I think most play 2 to 3, but don't quote me on that. You'll have to actually check for yourself if you want to study more. Ragavan is the best creature against Wrath of the Skies because it has haste, and it allows you to sort of re-tempo back when you get wrathed. It is not great in multiples, and I think that it's actually lower impact than something like Ocelot Pride, but it does play around the things that they have for you better than Ocelot Pride does, and Ocelot Pride is pretty bad unless you have Guide of Souls or unless it's turn 1. And so, like I talked about, stopping their snowball, they're also trying to stop your snowball. The times where they stop your snowball, your Ocelot Pride is basically a dead draw. The times where they stop your snowball, Ragavan isn't as dead of a draw. It's not great, but you want to try to get value where you can. And so Ragavan is better at getting value. If you had to choose between one or the other, I think you want to mix in both. There is argument to just cut all Ocelot Prides because of Wrath of the Skies and because Ragavan has haste. But I do think there's diminishing returns on having too many Ragavans in your deck. It is legendary, and Ocelot Pride is just insanely powerful. It's a very irreplaceable effect. So I like having 2 and 2. Here I cut The prisons, they're very bad here. I cut 1 Pride and 4 Ragavan. I think we're just very threat light post board for game 2. And I also think doing this on the draw is pretty loose. The Esper white-black decks don't have a lot of interaction on turn 1. So in order to leverage Boros' advantage, you want to have 1 drop into 2 drop into 3 drop. Your opponent can get out from underneath that, and they do have a lot of ways to sort of generate advantage. So if they start solituding, it's not as bad for them. But you want to set up your games where you need to force them to have it and force them to be behind. Otherwise, as the game goes long, they will outgrind you. The times where they don't have to pitch their solitude, they're not losing a potential card. So the times where we don't have as many early threats, we're not giving them the opportunity to like lose value, if that makes sense. And then ultimately, like, these vacuums and these blood moons just don't actually do that much in this matchup. All right, so this is a good example of why blood moon isn't great. We have it in our opener, which is exactly where you want something like this, and its impact is just so low. We have no answers to their snowball, so like they don't do anything on turn 1, which is good for us, like no Thoughtseize. They could have potential fatal push, but if they don't, it's actually not very punishing for them. If they just pass with 2 mana and play Thalia, or if they just pass with 2 mana, they don't even need to play Thalia. If they just pass with 2 mana, we can't attack with his Guide of Souls. If they fetch a blue source and play a frog, we're extremely far behind. If they, for some reason, play sorcery speed, surveil land, we still just don't even have a play. Like this line right here is actually best possible for us because this relic does nothing on this board. But we're still just not getting ahead at all. Obviously, our draws being Pyro, Wear Tear aren't the greatest. The Wear Tear isn't exactly a brick, but it's not great. The Pyro is functionally a brick at this point. We're just so far behind. And normally, their turn 3 plays aren't that strong, but it's just so much better than whatever we're going to be doing on turn 3 that we've kind of like kept a hand that has pushed us into a corner that is really hard to get out from underneath. And if we can get out from underneath that, honestly, like any 6 probably would have done the exact same thing. We are getting a little lucky here, and their Overlord missed. They hit Ephemerate, land, fatal push. Maybe a deck building mistake, maybe just unlucky. But this game is very funny because I think that I definitely shouldn't have kept this. I'm not sure if my opponent should have kept this if their best turn 3 play is Overlord with Relic Fatal Push, because there's a lot of draws I have that just punish them for only having 1 Fatal Push and no follow-up. Here is interesting. So to sort of assess the actual situation and not talk about all the things I think I'm doing wrong, in this moment, they have, 3 cards in their hand? And we know none of them are creatures they got with Overlord. So if their best play on turn 3 is to just Overlord, that means they probably don't have a Ketramose. That means they don't have a Thalia. It means they actually don't have a lot of like naturally good mid-range threats. What this does mean is that they could have things that sort of like rely on Overlord or that need to be set up for the late game. So they could have another Fatal Push, although it's unlikely they could have it. They could have a few lands. They could have an Ephemerate. They could have Boggart Trawler, the Exile a Graveyard flip land. They could have the white flip land card. They could have Emperor of Bones, and they would rather wait with Emperor of Bones with the Overlord to try and set it up a bit better to see if I put a Flager into the graveyard, etc. They could have another Overlord of the Baelmerk. So it's not entirely certain that their hand is known, but you can assume pretty safely that a lot of the things they have that are pretty impactful at this point in the game aren't in their hand. Now, with all that being said, if they have something like Flicker Wisp, and I don't know. I think that's the worst possible for me. I think that's the thing I should be playing towards. I really want to make sure that it's the least punishing for me, because I can't interact with the Overlord, right? What I'm getting to is that discarding this Flage I think is a good idea, but I really think I should have discarded the Blood Moon. And this goes back to what I said about sideboarding. The Blood Moon has no impact here. They left up a fetch land. They could fetch a swamp if they wanted to. It's unlikely they have any important blue cards in their deck right now that they wouldn't play, specifically Frog. But also, if they Flicker Wisp this Overlord, I need to sort of generate a way to gain some value back. I need to find a way to like not get overrun by this Overlord. It helps that we drew this Galvanic Discharge to kill it potentially, but I actually don't have enough energy, and discarding 2 cards and drawing 2 cards is random 2 cards. This Blood Moon's just worse than this Elegant Parlor, even though like if I draw a land in my top 2, it's always going to be a dead card. Just risking the times where it's 2 spells and I can't flash back the Flage the following turn is already pretty poor, and then keeping this Blood Moon when it's not going to do anything in this board state is just very narrow-minded and kind of ridiculous. Now, obviously not discarding the Blood Moon, they will usually fetch a Meticulous Archive here, and their mana will be pretty bad overall, but I still just can't actually put the Blood Moon into play at any point. And they have a plane, so if they have a Witch Enchanter, they can just naturally deal with it. Also, let's say I do put the Blood Moon in play this turn. They have so many spells on 3 mana that just like punish me for this being my third this turn play, right? And so like, again, just, I don't think you should have Blood Moon in this matchup unless you're looking to get very lucky. I don't really know what they kept. I don't really know what's on their side of the board. I think this game has been good for sort of talking about what I've done wrong and what to play against, but I don't know if it's actually a good showing of like a match of Magic. Again, I talked about it pre-boarding. I don't think I should put this God of Souls and this Season Pyro into play. I mean, it makes sense that I'm doing it because I don't want to cast this Blood Moon right now because it actually sewers my mana a lot, but I'm just really overplaying into Wrath of the Skies, and again, this is why I should have kept the Elegant Parlor. I could have even discarded this other Season Pyromancer if I was worried about Bowmasters. But realistically, like, I'm just overplaying into Wrath of the Skies. If I wanted to play one threat, I could just play the Guide of Souls, or I could just play the Blood Moon and try to slow down the game a little bit. But not hitting my 4th land in those top 3 cards is very punishing, but also I think this Elegant Parlor should just be in play last turn, and I think overplaying into Wrath of the Skies when my opponent has 3 cards, no plays on 4 mana is just ridiculous. Like, why am I doing this? What could they possibly have other than Wrath of the Skies and just a bunch of random fluff? Like, I guess they could have a Phalia, but they would have had to have drawn it after they overlorded, which is, it's just as likely or similar likelihood that they just have Wrath of the Skies. I just don't think I should be like making this play here. It really plays into a lot of potential things that they're just going to have naturally. This is another point of interest. I discharge on the upkeep. I think this is incorrect. I think that I should just wait until they go to begin combat. It sounds weird, but the times where they flash in Phalia, you don't want to kill it until they put the trigger on the stack, or until they're threatening to put the trigger on the stack. All right, did they just concede? I don't remember what happens here. They ended up having a whole lot of nothing. I wanted to make the point of it's very marginal, but I do want to talk about when to kill the Phalia. It didn't end up mattering here, and it is a little late in the game for it to matter overall, but in the times where you leave up mana to kill a Phalia when they flash it on their turn 2, don't kill it on the end step. Wait until they actually play the Overlord, and let the Overlord trigger resolve. Maybe even do it in begin combat. There's not many things that save the Thalia that actually stop you from killing it and allowing them to blink the Overlord. Ephemerate's the main one, and if they ephemerate the Thalia, like, I don't know, unlucky if it's that punishing, but it's not normally that punishing. But we did watch this game where the Overlord actually missed any targets on 4 random cards in their deck. I don't actually know if there's a mathematical way to break down what's more likely, them missing with Overlord or them having Ephemerate and it mattering. I don't think there is going to be like a strong, consistent way. But I think in the times where like they can miss with the Overlord, you should just wait to kill the Thalia. You know, you don't know if they're actually casting an Overlord. They could just be flashing in a Thalia. The other thing is the Overlord can miss, and if they ephemerate the Thalia, you're probably like, that's better than them ephemerating something else. You don't need to get trigger happy with your galvanic discharges all the time. So that's match 1. Hopefully, despite how poorly I played, some of it makes sense or translates about how I think you should be approaching the matchup. I don't think these games were necessarily good games, but they do show a lot of how the games play out or how I expect them to play out overall.